There is a postal route on the Rath corridor that nobody fights over. I know this because I drove it for 11 years before I ever saw anything on it worth stopping for. And I know it because when I finally retired and handed my delivery manifest to the district office in Rath, the young man behind the counter looked at the route designation and said with genuine sympathy that he was sorry about my luck. I told him I had liked it fine. He did not believe me. That was all right. The Rath corridor is a flat run of rust-colored hardpan that stretches roughly 400 kilometers between the freight depot at Rath station and the old relay terminal at Sondick's End. The road is graded twice a year whether it needs it or not, which means for most of its length it does not need it, and for the rest it needed it considerably more than twice. The landscape on either side is low scrub, gray-green, thorny, unimpressive. In the dry season, which accounts for roughly 9 of the planet's 12 months, a man could stand at the side of the road and watch nothing move for an hour and feel he had seen the place at its most representative. In the wet season there is mud and wind, and the occasional lightning storm crossing the flats so flat and fast that you watch it come for 20 minutes and still cannot quite believe it when it arrives. The settlements along the corridor were small and widely spaced: 3 farms, a fuel depot, a school that served 43 children, then 31, then 19 in the years I drove, a small machinery repair shop in a converted shipping container whose owner, a man called Petch, was the closest thing I had to regular conversation on the route. Petch drank too much tea and told the same stories about his army service in the Eastern Territories so many times I could have delivered them myself. But he was kind and his tea was strong, and on the bad winter days the warmth of his shop was worth more than either of us said. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand what the route was. I want you to understand that it was not dramatic. It was not scenic. The pay was standard. The truck was government tissue and smelled of rubber sealant, and the particular brand of pine-scented cleaning agent that the district depot used on its entire fleet. The radio picked up 2 stations clearly, and a third one only in certain weather, and the third was the most interesting. So most days I drove in near silence except for the wind off the flats and whatever I was thinking about. I am not, by disposition, a particularly romantic person. I have been told I am practical to a fault. My daughter Nessa said once that I could watch the sun come up over the ocean and immediately start thinking about whether I had left the kettle on, and she said it with enough affection that I took it as a compliment. I mention this only because what I am about to describe, what happened over 11 months at a waystation most people on this corridor did not know existed, might otherwise seem like the story of someone who was given to sentiment. I want to be clear that I was not. What I did because it seemed like the right thing to do. I did not do it for recognition. I did not do it for warmth, though it turned out to be one of the warmer things I have ever had a hand in. I did it because a creature was cold and hungry, and I had food, and there did not seem to be a good reason not to. That is, I think, more or less all there is to it. The waystation at kilometer 212 was not on my manifest. It had been decommissioned 4 years before I took the route, a small freight relay installation that had served a mining operation in the early days of corridor settlement, and had been closed when the mine played out. What remained was a rectangular prefabricated structure in the pale gray that government buildings in the territories tend to go when the paint weathers off, a loading dock along its south face, a collapsed cargo shelter to the east, and a comms mast that had been struck by lightning twice and now listed at an angle that made it look as though it was listening for something low to the ground. The access road off the main corridor was not signposted. I had found it in my 2nd year on the route, turning down it out of curiosity one afternoon when the day was long and nothing else was pressing, and I had found nothing in the building worth noting and nothing on the dock except old bolt marks in the decking and a faded load capacity sticker half peeled from a stanchion. After that, I went back perhaps once a month, for no particular reason. It was a place to stop. It faced southwest and caught the afternoon light well. I had been stopping there for 9 years before I found the creature. Or I suppose, before the creature found me. It was early in the wet season. One of those mornings in the first week of the rains when the air is cold enough that your breath hangs for a moment before it disperses, and the scrub has gone a deeper green overnight as though it has been waiting all year for permission to try. I had pulled off the main corridor and driven up the access road and parked in my usual spot beside the dock's south stairs, and I was eating my midday meal early because I had started early and my body had not been consulted about the schedule change. Cold flatbread, a portion of dried meat, a container of broth from the morning. I ate with the window down because the cold air was pleasant after the truck's heater, which ran hotter than it should have since Petch had repaired it in the spring, and had been apologetic about it ever since. I was on the last of the flatbread when I saw it. It was under the dock. Not far under, the dock stood on stanchion legs perhaps 1.5 meters above the hardpan, and the creature was positioned at the near edge of the shadow where the early morning light reached in about 0.5 meters before it gave out. It was small. I registered that first, small and dark, and entirely still in the way that things are still when stillness is a decision rather than a quality. It was watching me. I did not move. I had seen animals on the route before. The scrub had its share of them, low-crawling things, the occasional large-eared grazers that wintered in the corridor country before migrating north, a family of pale-coated burrowing creatures whose name I never learned that had colonized the drain culvert at kilometer 140. I had stopped for all of them in my way, noting them, giving them time to clear the road before I continued. I was not a person who was troubled by animals. This was not any animal I recognized. It was covered in scales, not the smooth overlapping scales of the river creatures in the farming districts, but something harder and more complex, with a quality of surface that suggested depth, as if each individual scale had its own internal structure. The color was a dark copper brown, richened in the edgelight where the morning reached it, and shaded to near black in the shadows of the dock's underside. I could see the outline of a head, wider than I would have expected, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that had a certain density to it, a solidity. What I had initially taken for a crouching position I now understood was a posture, deliberate, contained, front limbs folded, and a tail. I could see the tail now, curled in a partial spiral to one side, laid flat and motionless. There were what appeared to be wing structures folded tight against the body, nubbed and slightly asymmetrical, one sitting higher than the other. They had the proportions of wings on something not yet fully grown. We looked at each other. I finished the last piece of flatbread. Then slowly, I reached into my lunch container and picked up what remained of the dried meat, perhaps 1/3 of a portion, 3 or 4 strips, and leaned out the window. I put it on the edge of the dock's lowest step. Then I sat back. The creature did not move for a long time. I did not move either. The wind came across the flats in a slow, steady pressure, and the calm's mast creaked at its angle, and at some point 2 of the large-eared grazers crossed the access road 100 meters back without stopping. Then the creature moved. Not toward the meat directly. It shifted first to the left, then forward, coming from under the dock's shadow in a low, careful movement that kept most of its body close to the ground. Its claws, 3-toed, I could see now, with a short rearward digit that did not quite touch the ground when it walked, made a dry, precise sound on the hardpan, each footfall separate and deliberate. It moved to the foot of the stairs. It considered the meat on the step above it for a moment that felt significant in a way I could not have named. Then it took the meat, stepped back, and retreated to the shadow beneath the dock. I waited until I heard the sound of eating, a small, methodical sound, contained and unhurried, before I started the truck. I drove away. I came back the next day. It was there, same position, same stillness, the same quality of attention directed at me from the dock's shadow. I put another portion of dried meat on the step. I waited. It came and took it. I left. For 2 weeks I did this. I varied my stop time slightly, sometimes arriving in the early morning, sometimes not until midday, and the creature was always there, or became there within a few minutes of my arrival, which told me that it heard the truck turning off the main corridor long before I parked. After the first week, it stopped using the pretense of moving sideways first. It came forward when I put the meat down and took it without ceremony, which I found encouraging. After the second week, it stopped retreating fully beneath the dock and sat instead at the base of the stairs while it ate, which was more encouraging still. I began to bring extra meat. I am aware that what I have described so far is a relatively unremarkable account of a person feeding a creature they found sheltering under an abandoned building. People do this. People have always done this. There is an instinct in most of us, not all, but most, that responds to a hungry thing with the desire to make it less hungry, particularly if the hungry thing is small and contained about it and not asking. The creature never asked. It took what was offered, and it was measured about the taking, as if asking would have cost something it was not prepared to pay, and I respected that enormously. I understand the preference for taking care of yourself when it is available as an option. What I did not understand yet was what the creature was. I do not mean that I failed to identify the species. I mean that I had not yet fully registered the weight of what was in front of me. I am a practical person. I had seen images, everyone had seen images of the draconic peoples, the ancient races that moved through the larger corridors of the settled territories. The sovereignty envoys passed through Rath station twice a year in their sealed transports, and the children from the station school were sometimes brought out to watch from a distance, a kind of broad civic education. A reminder that the territories existed in a larger world than the dust-flat borderland suggested. I had seen one personally once at a transit checkpoint near Rath on a delivery run 15 years ago. A large adult, easily 3 times my height at the shoulder, scales the color of polished iron, moving through the transit hall with a precision and a settled authority that made the hall feel like a temporary thing around it. I had thought about that image for months afterward. Not with fear, with a certain adjustment of scale, a recalibration of what I understood the world to contain. The creature under the dock was not that. It was small. It was hungry. It was cautious in the way that small, hungry things are cautious, and it ate dried meat from the bottom step of a decommissioned waystation with the focused attention of something that did not know when it would eat next. But by the third week, I was beginning to notice things. The way it held itself, even in the settled eating posture, had a quality that did not suggest an animal. Animals, in my experience, eat with a certain absorption that blunts attention. The posture changes, the focus narrows, the world goes secondary to the food. The creature did not do this. It ate and watched simultaneously, and the watching was not the unfocused watchfulness of a prey animal listening for threats, but something more directed, more deliberate. It watched the road. It watched the sky. It watched me with a regularity and a specificity that made me feel, on some mornings, that I was being assessed, and that the assessment was ongoing, and that new data was being incorporated into it. On the 22nd day, it let me get out of the truck. I had not planned this. I simply needed to check the right front tire, which had developed a slow leak and made a sound on rough road that I wanted to look at before it became a larger problem. I opened the door and stepped out, and it was only when I was on the ground that I remembered the creature was at the base of the stairs, still finishing the morning portion. I stopped. It looked at me. Neither of us moved for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it went back to eating. I checked the tire. I walked back to the driver's side. I did not rush. The creature watched me get back into the truck with the same steady attention it gave everything else. And when I drove away, it was still sitting at the foot of the stairs in the pale morning light, its copper-brown scales catching a warmth from the sun that made the color richer than I had seen it, a deep amber running under the surface dark. I thought about that color for most of the drive back to Rath. The wet season settled in properly through the 6th and 7th weeks. The road got bad in stretches, and I had to route around a section near kilometer 180 that the drainage had undermined, adding 40 minutes to the run. The rains came mostly in the afternoons, which meant my morning stops at the way station were still possible, but on 2 occasions I arrived to find the hardpan around the dock turned to thin mud, and the creature positioned higher than usual. On the dock itself, I realized on the second occasion, sitting on the edge of the decking with the same containment it brought to every posture, waiting for what it had begun to understand was coming. I left an extra portion that day. The wind was cold off the flats, and the loading dock offered no shelter worth speaking of. On the way back, I stopped at Petch's shop and asked him if he had any scrap canvas he was not using. He had half a roll of the heavy weave material they use for machinery covers, which he gave me without asking questions, which was one of the things I valued about Petch. I took it home that night and cut a length of it and folded it and put it in the truck's utility compartment. The next morning I left it at the base of the stairs along with the food. I put it folded and weighted down with a piece of flat metal from the dock's own stanchion base, so the wind did not take it. The morning after that, the canvas was gone from the stairs. When I looked beneath the dock I could see it, dark against the darker shadow. The creature had pulled it to the back, and there was a quality about the arrangement that suggested it had been considered, not just dragged. The fold lines were different from the way I had left it. Something had thought about where to put it and how. I drove away, and I did not talk to anyone about what I had seen. I want to address this now directly, because Nessa asked me about it afterward, why I had not reported it, why I had not contacted the Transit Authority or the Corridor Administration or any of the agencies whose business such things arguably were. And my answer was not a satisfying one for her, though it was a true one. I did not report it because it did not seem like mine to report. The creature had not caused harm to anyone. It was living, apparently, beneath a structure that no one was using. It was eating food that I had elected to bring. The idea of involving an agency, any agency, in something that was, as I saw it, between me and whatever was under that dock, felt like a kind of trespass I was not willing to commit. I have filled out enough forms in my life to know that once a form is filled out, the event on the form belongs to the form and no longer to the people who were part of it. I was not ready for that. Also, I admit, I did not want anyone to take it away. That is the truth, and I am old enough not to be embarrassed by it. The wet season wore into its middle weeks, and the creature grew. Not dramatically, juveniles of any species grow incrementally, and I had no baseline from which to measure precisely. But I noticed it in the proportions, a small increase in height at the shoulder when it stood, a marginally greater length of neck when it raised its head to watch the road. The wing nubs that sat asymmetrically against its back had developed a broader surface area, not yet functional but more fully formed, and the scales at the leading edge of each had a brighter quality to the color, a burnished copper gold that caught the morning light distinctly. The crest along its skull, which I had originally taken for a brow ridge, was a true crest, I understood now, with small secondary structures behind the primary ridge that showed more clearly as the face matured. It was not difficult to look at. It was, in a word I used to myself without apology, beautiful. Not in the way that delicate things are beautiful. The structure was too substantial for that, too deliberately constructed, but in the way that well-made things are beautiful, things whose form has been arrived at through long and serious consideration. When it sat at the foot of the stairs in the morning light with its tail curled and its forelegs folded, and its head at rest in the posture I had come to think of as its neutral settled position, it had a quality of composed patience that I found myself, in honest moments, wanting to measure myself against. On the 53rd morning, I know the number because I had begun keeping notes, a habit from my early years on the route. It spoke to me. I do not mean this loosely. I mean it literally. I had parked and had been sitting in the usual silence while it ate, and I had been thinking about a problem with the manifest routing that the district office had sent through that week, and I was not thinking about the creature at all, which may have been why it felt safe enough to do it. The sound was not in a register I was entirely comfortable with, a low resonance with a quality that was more felt than heard. The way the low note of a large instrument will reach through the body differently than it reaches through the ears. But laid over that was something higher, complex, a series of tonal variations that my ear immediately began trying to map to language and did not quite succeed. What I felt from it, which is the only way I can honestly describe the experience, was a question. Not words, a question shape, something directed at me with a specificity that was unmistakable. I said, "I don't know what you're saying, but I'm listening." The creature looked at me for a long time. Then it made the sound again, shorter, different in the high register, and what I felt from it this time was not a question but something that might have been an acknowledgement. I went back to the truck and drove my route and thought about it for 400 kilometers. By the time I reached Sondik's End and turned for the return run, I had not reached any conclusions except that whatever was under that dock was not an animal, and I had, I suspected, known this for some time. We did not achieve language between us. I want to be clear about that. There was no moment of dawning mutual comprehension, no slow decipherment that unlocked communication. What developed over the weeks that followed was something more limited and more durable than language, a grammar of presence. I knew what it meant when it sat at the foot of the stairs versus when it waited at the dock edge above. I knew the difference between the stillness that meant it was tracking something in the sky and the stillness that meant it was simply resting. I knew that when it made the low resonance without the high tonal overlay, it was not directing anything at me, but at something I could not perceive. I knew that when it let me approach within 3 meters, which happened first on the 61st morning slowly, with me making no sudden movements and thinking, somewhat absurdly, calm thoughts as if it could read them, and settled its forelegs and did not move. This was a form of trust I had not been given before and should not treat lightly. It did not touch me, I did not touch it. This was not a failure of the relationship. It was the relationship. 11 months of mornings at a decommissioned way station on a route nobody wanted, and it was enough. The dry season came back around and the scrub went gray-green again, and the road needed what it always needed. The creature, I did not name it. I had referred to it in my notes only as the little one, which was less accurate by the month, but which felt correct in some way I could not improve on, had begun to spend some mornings on the dock rather than beneath it. From above, with the sun catching its back, the copper brown of the scales resolved into a pattern I had not been able to see from the ground. A faint darker structure running from the base of the skull along the spine, a series of diamond-shaped markings at regular intervals that were almost the same color as the surrounding scales but not quite. They were subtle enough that in most lights they were invisible, but in certain angles of the morning sun they caught slightly differently, a matte surface against the surrounding gloss, and when I looked at the pattern carefully it had a quality that was not random. It had a repetition to it, a regularity that reminded me of something encoded. I thought about this on and off for several weeks. On the 294th morning, roughly 9 months in, I arrived at the way station, and the little one was not at the dock. I waited. I ate my meal. I refilled the water I had started leaving in an old field container beside the stairs, which it drank from irregularly and probably supplemented from other sources. I sat in the truck for an hour past my normal stop time, until the manifest schedule required me to leave, and I drove away slowly, watching the dock and the shadow beneath it for the full length of the access road back to the main corridor. I told myself it had gone somewhere. Animals, creatures move. It had been ranging farther as it grew. I had seen evidence of this in the tracks around the way station's perimeter on mornings after rain. It would return. It did return. 2 mornings later it was at the foot of the stairs as if nothing had happened, and it took the food with its usual measured attention and regarded me with its usual specificity, and I found that my relief was considerable enough to be somewhat embarrassing. I mentioned this to no one. But I had been thinking in those 2 days about what I would do if it did not come back, and I had understood in the thinking of it that there was nothing I could do. I had no way to look for it. I had no way to communicate its existence to anyone who might help. I had not photographed it. I owned a camera but had not brought it to the waystation, for reasons that were complex and had to do with a feeling I could not fully articulate about the nature of what was happening there, a sense that the camera would change something about it that I was not willing to change. I had my notes. I had the memory of the canvas in the shadows, and the sound that was a question, and the 3-meter distance that was trust. None of it was anything I could act on. I had begun, around the 7th month, to vary the food. Not dramatically. I was a person of limited culinary imagination and a fixed shopping pattern, and I had learned early that the creature was not in a position to be selective. But I had added dried fish when I found it at the Rath market at a reasonable price, and on 2 occasions I had brought a cooked portion from the lunch room at the depot, wrapped in paper, which the little one had investigated with considerable and flattering attention before eating. I had also learned, over several weeks of observation, that it disliked the flatbread unless the flatbread was reasonably fresh. Stale flatbread it would eat, but with a particular quality of resignation that I found I could not watch without some embarrassment on behalf of the food. I had also begun to pay attention to the water. The field container I had left in the 4th month was a battered metal thing, slightly rust-stained at the rim, and I refilled it on my morning stops when I found it low. I did not know the creature's water requirements and could only infer from the container's level how much was being consumed versus how much was evaporating in the dry season heat. I began to keep a second container in the truck as reserve. Practical, again. If the first was damaged or went missing, I did not want to arrive and find nothing. All of this occupied perhaps 10 minutes of my morning on the days I stopped. Sometimes less, when the creature was already at the stairs and the stop could be kept brief. Sometimes somewhat more, on the mornings when it was on the dock above, and I stood beneath it in the growing light for a while. Not for any purpose I could have named, simply because the company was good and the alternative was driving, and the light on the flats at that hour did things to the scrub color that I had been watching for 11 years and had not yet tired of. I thought about those mornings sometimes on the long flat runs between the farms. I thought about what I actually knew of the creature, which was not nothing, though it was also not what I would have wanted to know. I knew its routines better than I knew the routines of most people. I knew the difference between a resting posture and a tracking posture, between a still that meant it was processing something and a still that meant it had simply paused. I knew the sound it made when it was satisfied, and the different, more complex sound it made on the coldest mornings when the wind had come off the flats all night, and the dock offered no shelter worth speaking of. I did not know where it went on the days it was absent, 2 or 3 times in the full 11 months, brief absences that I told myself were natural and probably were. I did not know whether it was eating from other sources or whether what I brought constituted its primary food supply. I suspected the latter and felt, about this, a concern that I did not examine too closely, because it would have led me to questions I was not prepared to answer. I started thinking about photographs. Not about taking them, I still resisted that, but about whether I should. About what the little one's existence meant in terms larger than the 2 of us and the waystation and the 50 extra grams of dried meat per morning. I am a practical person, and I tried to be practical about this. Something draconic was living unsupported on the Rath corridor with no apparent protection and no apparent connection to any group or power that might be looking for it. I had been providing food and minimal shelter materials for 9 months. I would not be driving this route forever. The truck would go to someone else, and the manifest would go to someone else, and the waystation at kilometer 212 was not on the manifest, and whoever took over the route would not stop there, because there was no reason to stop there unless you were the kind of person who turned down unmarked access roads out of curiosity, and most people were not. I had a conversation with Nessa that week that I did not fully explain to her. I told her I was thinking about retiring. She said I had been saying this for 3 years. I said I meant it this time. She said she was glad and that Rath station was a long drive from the capital and she worried about the road conditions in the wet season. I said the road was fine. She said the road was not fine, she had driven it. I said I would think about the retirement seriously. I did not tell her about the little one. I still cannot fully explain why. Partly the old habit of keeping certain things separate. My route was mine in a way that my family life was mine, compartmentalized not out of secrecy, but out of a sense that each thing should have its own space. Partly the same resistance to forms and agencies that had kept me quiet before. Partly something else, something to do with trust and the earning of it. Something to do with the fact that the little one had given me something in those 11 months that I was not sure I had the right to distribute. It had trusted me, specifically me. The truck, the time of morning, the particular sound of the door opening, the particular distance I kept. It had learned me the way you learn a thing you intend to rely on. And if I introduced variables I had not earned the right to introduce, I would be spending currency I had not deposited. I decided to stay on the route. I did not decide what to do about the rest of it. On the 321st morning, I turned off the main corridor at kilometer 212 and drove up the access road and saw a ship on the waystation pad. This was not a landing pad. The waystation had had a landing designation in its operational years, but the beacon had been dark for as long as I had known the place, and nothing had landed there in the 11 years of my route. The ship that was on the pad now was not large, perhaps twice the length of my truck, matte surfaced in a dark coloring that absorbed the morning light rather than reflecting it, no visible markings. But it had the quality of something that was exactly what it was and not pretending to be anything else. It sat level and precise on the cracked pad concrete, as if it had thought about where to be and had decided. I stopped the truck at the edge of the access road's last curve, where the waystation building was visible, but the pad was only partially in sight. There were 3 figures on the pad. 2 of them I identified quickly as attendants of some kind, flanking, positioned, not moving except to track. The third was larger. Substantially larger. It stood at the foot of the ship's ramp with its back to me, and even from 200 meters I could see the scale of it, 3.5 meters at the shoulder at least, perhaps more, with a build that suggested old mass, the kind of body that has been used seriously for a long time and knows itself thoroughly. The color of its scales was a deep gray-green, edged in something dark at the trailing margins of each plate, and it wore, I registered this slowly, the kind of structured materials across its upper body that I had seen in images of sovereignty attendants, fitted pieces in dark material that had a formal quality without being armor. It was not armored. It was, I understood with a certainty that took a moment to settle, wearing something ceremonial. It was looking at the dock. The little one was on the dock. Not at the foot of the stairs, not beneath it on the dock itself, standing at the far edge, facing the ship. It was still. Its tail was low and its crest was raised and its wing nubs were half extended, which was something I had never seen before. The extension made the asymmetry more obvious. The right nub perhaps 5 centimeters broader at the span than the left, a difference that in full-grown wings would be meaningful in terms of flight geometry, but which in these proportions was not yet consequential. It looked small on the dock above them. It looked very small. The large one on the pad made a sound. Not loud, I was 200 meters away, and the wind was across my position, carrying sound toward me. But even at that distance, and in that register, I could feel the lower frequencies of it, a bone-level resonance that I recognized from the 53rd morning, from the quality of being addressed by something that used its whole body to speak. The sound was different from that morning, different in the tonal structure and different in what I felt from it. And what I felt, which I note again is the only honest way I have of describing this, was something between a name and a homecoming. Not words, the shape of homecoming. The little one made a sound back. I recognized the high register of it, the particular tonal pattern. I had heard it before. I had heard it on cold mornings when I drove away. I sat in the truck for a long time. The two attendants moved to the base of the dock stairs. They were perhaps 2 meters at the shoulder, scaled in a dark russet, and they moved with the efficiency of things that had been trained carefully and were not currently uncertain about what they were doing. The little one came down the stairs. It moved differently than it usually moved, not the low-body, ground-close caution of the first weeks, but a different posture, weight forward, head higher, the crest fully raised. It walked to the base of the stairs and stopped, and for a moment it looked back toward the truck. I don't know why I got out. Habit maybe. I had always gotten out. The tire check on the 22nd morning, and every morning after when the situation permitted, because the creature had responded to my being on the same level as a concession of distance, a small signal of equality that it seemed to read clearly. I got out of the truck and I stood beside it. The large one on the pad turned. I have been trying since that morning to describe the experience of being looked at by something of that size and that kind of age. It is not a fear experience. I want to be precise about this. Fear is a physical reaction, and what I felt was not physical in that way. It was more like suddenly understanding the full dimensions of a room you thought you had measured. The large one looked at me, and I felt looked at, comprehensively, in a way that included not just the present moment but seemed to reach for context, for the accumulated information of 11 months of mornings that it could not have witnessed but was, I understood, aware of. The expression was unreadable to me. The face was nothing like a human face, and I had no reference points for its emotional register. But the stillness of the attention had a quality I recognized from the little one, and from myself on good days, and I chose to read it the way it felt. I raised one hand, palm out. It was the gesture I had used when I wanted to signal to the little one that I was not approaching, that I was staying where I was, that there was no urgency. It was the only gesture I had that I knew the little one understood. The little one made a sound, one of the high-register ones, brief. The large one, and I will tell you what this cost me in terms of adjustment, in terms of the category reclassification that happened in the space of about 3 seconds, lowered its head. Not a small lowering, a sustained, deliberate arc from the full standing height down to a point where the great angular head was perhaps 1.5 meters from the ground, the crest partially folded, the posture held before it raised again. One of the attendants spoke, in trade common, not well, with an accent that shaped the consonants differently than I was used to, but clearly enough. The heir to the Rath sovereignty asks to speak to you. I looked at the attendant. I looked at the little one. The little one had moved during this exchange to stand between the two attendants, and it was looking at me with its familiar specificity, the same assessment it had directed at me on the first morning from the dock's shadow, 22 days before it came to the stairs. The crest was high. The wing nubs were still extended. I said, the little one is the heir. The attendant said, Keth Vareth, third of the Rath bloodline. The convoy that carried the heir was lost in a storm surge event 14 months ago. All escort vessels were destroyed. The heir survived. We have been searching this sector for 14 months. I stood with this for a moment. 14 months, I said. The sovereignty cannot broadcast a search for a missing heir. The announcement would have invited intervention. We searched without announcement. 47 vessels quartering this sector for 14 months. I thought about 47 vessels quartering the Veth corridor sector in silence for 14 months, while the heir to the Rath sovereignty ate dried meat from the bottom step of a decommissioned waystation. You didn't find the waystation, I said. The beacon was dark. The station did not appear on active facility registries. I thought about the manifest. I thought about how the station was not on the manifest. It's not on my manifest either, I said. I found it by turning down an unmarked road. The attendant translated this. The large one, the envoy, was still watching me. It made a sound and the attendant translated. The envoy asks how long you have been maintaining the air. Maintaining was a word I might not have chosen, but which was not inaccurate. 11 months, I said, since the start of the last wet season. Another exchange. A longer one this time, and I watched the little one during it, Rath, third of the Rath bloodline, standing between the attendants with its crest raised and its weight forward, and its small asymmetrical wing nubs half spread. It was looking at the envoy, and then at me, and then at the envoy, and its tail was moving in a slow, deliberate arc that I had seen before, but only rarely, on mornings when something in the distance had caught its attention, and it had not yet decided what to do about it. The attendant said, "The envoy wishes to know what you provided." I said food, dried meat mostly, some flatbread on occasion, water in a field container, a length of canvas for shelter in the wet season. I paused. I stopped by every morning on my route. I stayed until it finished eating. I kept the same time where I could. There was a long exchange after this one. The envoy spoke and the attendants listened, and the little one made the high register sound twice, briefly, and I stood beside my government tissue truck in the morning light and waited. The attendant said, "The envoy says, the Rath sovereignty has searched 14 months for the air. The air survived 14 months on the Rath corridor. The envoy wishes to know if you understand what it is you kept alive." I looked at the little one. At the copper-brown scales in the morning light, the crest raised, the wing nubs extended, the three-toed claws on the waystation's cracked pad concrete. At the eyes that had watched me from the dock's shadow on the first cold morning of the wet season while I ate my flatbread, 11 months and 3 weeks ago. I said I had a general idea it was important. The attendant rendered this. The envoy made a sound and the attendant translated, and I heard, in the attendant's careful trade common, something I was not entirely prepared for. The sovereignty had treaties pending, 3 fleet postures in active review, 2 councils in session awaiting the heir's return to legitimacy. The envoy says, for 14 months the matter of peace held its breath. It held its breath on the Rath corridor because the air held its breath on the Rath corridor, because a postal driver turned down an unmarked road. I thought about the 3 farms and the fuel depot and the school that had gone from 43 students to 19. I thought about the route nobody fought over. I thought about peace holding its breath and what that meant in terms of what could have been breathing instead. The envoy spoke again, and this time it did not wait for translation. It turned to the little one, to Rath, and made the sound I had heard from the dock at 200 meters, the one that had felt like homecoming, and the little one walked to it. Walked to the envoy and pressed the top of its head, that wide-browed, crest-raised head that I had watched grow more defined through 11 months of mornings, against the envoy's lowered jaw, and held there. And the envoy curled its neck and held there too, and I looked at the cracked concrete of the pad and thought about practical things for a moment until I had myself steady. The attendant said, "The envoy will take the air home. The sovereignty will send representatives to Rath Station within 30 days. They will need the account of the 11 months, the full account, for the record. The envoy wishes you to know that the record will be correct. The record will not diminish what was done here." I said I left dried meat on a step. I don't think the record needs to be elaborate. The attendant said something to the envoy. The envoy looked at me again, that comprehensive stillness, and then it did something I did not expect and have never been able to fully describe. It turned its head slightly to one side, and then back, and made a very quiet sound in the lower register, the bone-level resonance without any of the high tonal overlay. No question. No statement. Something I can only describe as a recognition, a formal one, the kind that is not the beginning of something but the naming of something that has already been. Rath, the little one, separated from the envoy and walked to me, stopped at 2 meters, the same distance it had first closed to on the 61st morning. It made the high register sound brief, the one I had heard on mornings when I drove away. I raised my hand, palm out. The little one held my gaze for a moment that I did not count and could not have counted. Then it turned and walked up the ship's ramp, precise and unhurried, the wing nubs half extended, the crest high. The envoy and the attendants followed. The ramp closed and I stood on the pad and watched the ship lift from the cracked concrete with a smooth precision that was completely unlike the freight ships I saw at Rath station, and it banked east into the morning sky and was gone within a minute. I stood there for a while. The pad was quiet. The morning had advanced during the exchange, and the sun was higher than I was used to finding it at a waystation stop, and it struck the cracked concrete at a flat angle that made the whole surface look pale and considered. The ship's departure had left nothing, no scorch marks, no visible trace of the landing, and without the ship, and without the little one, the waystation was simply a decommissioned building on a corridor that nobody fought over, the comms mast at its angle, the scrub going quietly about its business to the east. I thought about what the attendant had said. 47 vessels quartering this sector for 14 months, and none of them had found the waystation because the beacon was dark, and the road was not signposted, and the station was not on any active registry. 47 vessels and the heir to the Rath sovereignty had survived on dried meat from the bottom step of a building that did not technically exist in anyone's current paperwork. I thought about the word maintaining which the attendant had used, and I thought about whether the word was accurate and decided that it was, in the same way that all accurate words are slightly narrower than the thing they describe. I had maintained the heir. I had also, without knowing it, maintained something considerably larger than one juvenile draconic creature's caloric intake. And sitting with that information on a cracked concrete pad in the early dry season morning was a strange kind of quiet after 11 months of not knowing it. I did not feel important. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this account in which the revelation reshapes the teller's understanding of herself, in which the knowledge of what the small thing meant upgrades the small thing retroactively into something large. That is not quite what happened for me. What I felt mostly was tired in the good way that comes after something is finished, and a particular quality of blankness that I associate with the moment after a long drive when you have been watching the road with all of your attention, and you finally stop, and you have not yet recalibrated to standing still. The blankness was not empty. It was full of 11 months of mornings, which is a considerable amount of material to have in any given blankness. I also thought with a specificity that surprised me about the sound the little one had made from the dock when it went away. The high register one, the one I had heard on mornings when I drove back to the main corridor. I had always thought of it as a sound of watching, the particular attention directed at the departing truck, a notation of absence. Sitting on the pad with the morning advancing around me, I understood that I had been hearing it wrong. Not wrong in its detail, the creature had been watching, and the sound had been directed at me, but wrong in what I thought it was doing. It had not been noting absence. It had been keeping a record. I thought about that for a long time. Then I got into the truck and checked my manifest and drove the rest of the route. At Sondik's End, I sat in the empty parking lot for longer than I usually did and looked at the sky and thought about 30 days and representatives at Rath station, and what the full account of 11 months would sound like when someone other than me was deciding how to render it. I thought about Nessa and whether I would tell her now or after the representatives came. I thought about the canvas in the dock's shadow and whether it was still there or whether the wind had moved it in the weeks since the little one had stopped sheltering under the dock. I thought about the 53rd morning, and the sound that was a question, and whether I had, in some limited and imprecise way, answered it. I thought about a thing the envoy had done that I had not fully processed until the silence of the parking lot gave me space to sit with it. The small sideways turn of the head, followed by the lower register sound without tonal overlay, the one that had felt like a recognition. I had been trying, on the drive to Sondik's End, to locate a human equivalent for it, a gesture I had a name for, a ritual I could place. I could not quite manage it. It was not a bow. It was not the nod one worker gives another at the end of a long shift. It was something from a register of gesture that I did not have access to by background or education, and the translation I had settled on, provisionally, was a kind of formal acknowledgement between peers, not of rank but of function. Both of us had done a job. The envoy was recognizing that, in its own way, in the only way it had available to it. I sat with that for the remainder of the stop. In 32 days, 2 Rath sovereignty representatives came to Rath station. Not the district office, they came to my home, which I respected for its directness. They were not as large as the envoy, but they were unmistakably sovereignty in their bearing and their materials, and they sat across from me at my kitchen table, and asked careful questions and wrote things down in a notation I could not read but which was produced with a deliberateness that suggested care. On the matter of the dried meat and the canvas and the water container, they said very little. On the matter of the 11 months and the daily stops and the maintained schedule, they said somewhat more, and there was a quality to what they said that I found difficult to absorb at a sitting. On the day they left, they gave me a document in trade common with a secondary column, in a script I could not read. The trade common column was precise and dry and administrative in its language, and it said, among other formal things, that the Rath sovereignty recognized in its formal record the 11 months of care provided to Rath, third of the Rath bloodline, at the waystation at kilometer 212 of the Rath corridor, by a frontier postal driver acting alone, without instruction, without knowledge of the heir's identity, and without expectation of recognition or return. It used a word in the secondary column that one of the representatives translated for me, unprompted, as they were leaving. I asked them to repeat it, and they did. Rath, they said, a compound of the Rath formal registry. The nearest trade common rendering was something like, one who kept the fire company while it was going out, not knowing it was the fire. I said I was not sure that was accurate. I said the little one had never seemed to me like something going out. The representative considered this. Then they said that the term in the Rath formal register was not about the fire's condition. It was about the quality of the company. I thought about that. I still think about it, on mornings when I drive past the corridor. I drive it sometimes in my retired life, for no reason I feel I need to explain. I stop at kilometer 212, and I drive up the access road and I park beside the dock's south stairs. The canvas is long gone. The cracked pad concrete holds a few lines of weather and time. The comms mast still lists at its angle, still seeming to listen for something low to the ground. I sit in my car and eat my midday meal, and I think about how peace can hold its breath in a place no one is looking, and how it sometimes takes a person who turns down unmarked roads to find it, and how the finding is usually smaller than anyone later makes it seem. Then I drive home and feed the cat and call Nessa, who still worries about the road. The road is fine. It has always been fine. You just have to know where to turn.